World War II on the Canadian home front. What was different between World War II and World War I for Canada? And to start, one of the biggest differences was Canada could make the decision about going to war, unlike what happened in the First War. So let's get started. To begin, we go to Halifax. Like in World War I, Halifax was also very important. By this point, Halifax had been rebuilt from the disaster of the two ships colliding in 1917. And Halifax was a major city for incoming British refugees, especially children, and that was because of the Battle of Britain. Halifax was a major naval center of operations. In fact, actually, Halifax has a really interesting history of Navy in general, going all the way back to around the 1700s when the city was originally founded by the British to be a counterpoint to the French fortress of Louisbourg before the Seven Years' War. And in fact, actually today, Halifax is a major center for the Canadian Navy, as there's the construction of the Arctic patrol ships for the Royal Canadian Navy, and after that's done, the replacement for the frigates. But in World War II, Halifax was the major center. It was also a base for Allied and British shipping routes, and because of that, it was sometimes targeted by Nazi U-boats. The typical harbor in Halifax using Canadian corvettes. This same photo now is the location of Irving Shipping Yards, the location of the program called Ships for Canada that I mentioned just before. A convoy is when there is a group of merchant vessels that are traveling together to provide greater protection. The merchant vessels, as you can see in the picture, were in the middle and were scattered in random intervals and directions, where the destroyers and the sloops and, say, the corvettes would form a defensive line around it. The convoy will form the basis of the Battle of Atlantic. Here's an example of the convoy getting into position just outside of Halifax before setting sail across the Atlantic to get to Great Britain. The Battle of Atlantic will be when many ships were sunk by Nazi U-boats in an attempt to make the British surrender to Nazi Germany. A lot of Canadian lives and ships were lost in the harshness, the frozen cold of the North Atlantic. As was mentioned before, Newfoundland was not part of Canada yet. Newfoundland did not join Canada until 1949. But despite this, and being a colony of Great Britain, Newfoundland did still work closely with Canada. And Canadian troops were stationed in Newfoundland, and in particular the Royal Canadian Air Force had bases in Newfoundland, and the Royal Canadian Air Force would fly sortie missions, so flights from Newfoundland to help protect the convoy, engage if they spotted Nazi U-boats, and more importantly, keep an eye open to see if there was Nazi U-boats nearby, and when they were spotted, to warn the convoy. One of the greatest contributions Canada had was the British Commonwealth Air Training Program, or BCATP for short. The program started in the same year the war did, 1939, and it brought crews from all over Canada and British Commonwealth to train in essentially Canada. Canada provided fields while Britain provided instructors, and from this program, over 130,000 people would be graduated. Pilots, navigators, bombers, gunners, wireless operators. It was to provide the volume needed to fight in the Battle of Britain against the Luftwaffe until the tide of war had turned against the Nazi Party. In fact, actually, originally on, Churchill wanted Australia to be the original destination for this program, but Canada was a lot closer. If you ever see airplanes actually have this yellow scheme for collectors or smaller airfields, you know it's referring to this great program. And a lot of actual airports exist now in Canada today, especially here in Lower Mainland, whether it's Pitt Meadows, Boundary Bay, Langley, Abbotsford, or Vancouver, or YVR. These are all where essentially airfields that were established because of this program. And one by one, in the years after the war, were given over to civilian authority. When the war came to Pacific, Imperial Japan invaded mainland China, and this worried many Canadians along the west coast. For the longest time, Canadian point of view was always looking to the east. Europe was to the east. But what was happening in Manchuria, the attack of Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Hong Kong, the fall of the Philippines, it made Canadians realize that war was on both fronts. There was a word for it, surrounded. And Canadians felt that the suddenness of these Imperial Japanese attacks were worrisome, especially when activity was detected by a lighthouse nearby Vancouver Island. Because of all that and the legacy of Victorian attitudes, the government established in 1940 the Japanese internment camps. In these internment camps, over 22,000 Japanese Canadian citizens who lived in British Columbia were given 24 hours to pack up 2 suitcases and were sent to these camps for their own protection, even though they had been targeted by anti-Asian organizations such as the Anti-Exclusion League. Japan was seen people as spies, even though there has been almost no evidence to ever point that they were spies, and in fact most of them had never even been to Japan. But as a result of the paranoia in BC, Ottawa decided to round all the males up and send them away to remote camps in northern British Columbia. As you can see, where they were located mainly here on the map, whereas work camps, housing, cleaning. This was made possible for the government because of the War Measures Act. And the same act, that was also the whole FLQ crisis, martial law allowed the government to detain people. They sent them to sugar camps in BC, beef farms in Alberta, Ontario, or Manitoba. Families were broken apart, the living conditions were awful. All property was forfeited to the government, and these camps will not come to end until 1947. These are kind of typical examples of the people. Even like the baseball team, the Agashi Tigers, would cease to exist after 1941. They were full-fledged participating citizens in the country. Well, that's the thing about, especially in the war in the Pacific, it would take on a different turn of a war, as neither side would view the other as a person. Look at this picture closely, you might be able to see the difference of how the Americans treated the internment camps versus the Canadians. I visited one of the sites called the Yellowhead Internment Camp. It was on the Yellowhead Highway, about half an hour west before you reach Jasper in Alberta. What really caught my attention was there was absolutely nothing here. One picnic bench, one garbage can, like one outhouse, and this pavilion talking about it. Otherwise, there was nothing left. It had all been erased. And I thought that was a really powerful message and kind of showed how times have changed. In fact, the only thing really was occasional car driving by and the sound of the bugs and the crickets buzzing away on a hot summer day in August. The National Selective Services Act basically made no one was allowed to be unemployed. Basically, poof, the Great Depression would come to an end. Essentially, World War II would end the Great Depression. There, everyone was back to work. And the Canadian government could now tell industries what they were doing, when, create, how much, when, costs, etc. It was complete control. There was no open free market. And workers who took a job without consulting the NSS could be fined up to $500. Total war, as I mentioned in the previous notes, the total war for World War II would be very similar, but yet very much different compared to the First War. Another example of how it's different was our economy and industry. While C.D. Howe was the Minister of Industrial Production, he created the Department of Munitions and Supplies. And in this department, C.D. Howe could tell the industry what they're going to produce, when, and why, and how much these goods would be delivered, and the price for it. There is, as I said before, no open free market. And to help that further along, there was the Hyde Park Declaration, where Canada could be finding themselves in a difficult situation financially because of the war or the Battle of Britain. And so the Hyde Park Declaration marked kind of like a time where we would say become more aligned and closer dependent on the United States rather than Great Britain. And in fact, actually, the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, convinced Roosevelt that buying Canadian goods would be better for both nations. And so the U.S. will buy over $1 billion worth of Canadian goods. Essentially, the historical perspectives of the Hyde Park Declaration was that it marked the beginning of closer, deepening, twined economic ties between Canada and the United States. And with economics too, there was a Wage and Price Control Board there, where all prices and wages were frozen in place. No inflation. This was the way to directly affect and to prevent the profiteering situation that had happened in the First World War. It also determined who needed to buy what was considered as rare goods, while also encouraging the practice of wartime rationing of food and supplies. There was also war brides. And war brides came from nearly every country throughout the British Commonwealth, but the Canadians were amongst the first to join the British in the fight there. So there was a lot of weddings and marriages before the boys were sent overseas to fight. And those who survive would be part of the root of the baby boomers. A lot of our parents or grandparents' generation will be born in the years after the war. War brides. While Canada did not have a conscription crisis in 1917 that divided the country upon English and French relations, there was still an issue of conscription. And then it was not necessary conscription, but conscription if necessary. What did that really mean? While Prime Minister King promised that there would not be another conscription crisis of 1917, there was mounting pressure from English Canadians that more needs to be done in the fight against Hitler. And so there was the National Resources Mobilization Act, which was conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. But the conscription would happen, but if those who were conscripted were not actually sent overseas to fight. They would be conscripted to be just part of homeland defense, and defense only. But Mackenzie realized this plan would be enough, and so he held a plebiscite. The people said yes. That was also what happened in 1916. It didn't exactly result in a lot more people being recruited, as they only conscripted about 16,000, but they all were for the homeland defense. Canada also had prisoner of war camps, several in British Columbia and a couple in Ontario. And the last, I always found interesting, was the Alaska Highway. Alaska Highway would be built under 1 year. And there was a race between the Canadian side and the American side there because it was wartime. So First Nations concerns, environmental concerns, nothing was consulted. It's just the attitude of get it done.